Somewhere in the back of your grandmother's kitchen cabinet, behind the cast iron skillet and the good china she never used, there was a small cardboard box. Plain, unassuming, maybe a little yellowed around the edges. And whatever was inside that box could clean her stovetop, scrub her bathroom tile, strip grease off her oven door, and polish her sink to a mirror shine, all for about $1. You've probably never heard of it. That's the strange part. Because for decades, this powder was everywhere. It was in nearly every American home. Housewives swore by it. Hardware store owners stocked it by the case. People passed it down like a family recipe, whispering the name like it was some kind of insider knowledge. And then, almost overnight, it was gone. Pulled from shelves. Quietly discontinued. Replaced by a dozen brightly colored bottles with cartoon bubbles on the label and prices 5 times higher. Nobody made a big announcement. There was no news story, no public outrage, no congressional hearing. It just vanished, and the cleaning industry moved on like it had never existed. But here's what's interesting. The people who remember it, and there are still plenty of them, will tell you it outperformed almost everything that came after. They'll tell you no modern product has ever quite matched it. And when you start digging into why it disappeared, the answers you find are not exactly what you'd expect. This is the story of a product most of the country has completely forgotten. A powder that cost almost nothing, cleaned almost everything, and disappeared in 1979 under circumstances that are, depending on who you ask, either completely ordinary or not ordinary at all. So what was it exactly? The powder goes by a few names depending on who you're talking to and where they grew up. Some people called it washing soda. Others knew it as sal soda or soda ash or just sodium carbonate, the chemical name that shows up in old household guides and cleaning manuals going back well over 100 years. It's a white, slightly granular powder. Odorless, unassuming. The kind of thing you'd walk right past without a second thought. And yet for most of American domestic history, it sat in kitchens right alongside flour and salt, treated as something just as essential. The origins aren't mysterious. Sodium carbonate has been used by human civilizations for thousands of years. Ancient Egyptians used a naturally occurring form of it called natron to preserve mummies and clean linens. Medieval European households extracted it from wood ash and seawater. By the 1800s, industrial processes made it cheap and widely available, and it moved from the apothecary into the general store. By the time American households were modernizing, running water, cast iron stoves, the whole transformation, washing soda was already a fixture. It came in before the refrigerator, before the vacuum cleaner, before practically everything we think of as modern domestic life. And what it could do was remarkable, especially when you consider it cost almost nothing. Grease on a stovetop? A small amount of washing soda dissolved in warm water cut right through it. Hard water deposits building up in a sink or a bathtub? Gone. Laundry gone gray and dingy from years of inadequate washing? Add a scoop to the wash and the fabric came out noticeably brighter. People used it on tile, on concrete, on outdoor furniture, on stuck-on food inside cast iron pans. Farmers used it to clean equipment. Mechanics used it to degrease engine parts. It stripped mineral buildup from pipes, freshened drains, and deodorized garbage cans without leaving behind any synthetic fragrance. It wasn't magic, it was chemistry. But to the people using it every day, the results felt close enough to magic that the distinction didn't much matter. What made it especially appealing was its flexibility. You controlled the concentration. A light solution for delicate cleaning, a stronger one for heavy-duty jobs. One product, one box, one price, and you made it work for whatever you needed. There was no matching the right bottle to the right surface, no reading labels, no worrying about chemical reactions between product A and product B. You just knew how to use it, and you used it, and it worked. That simplicity was the whole point, and for generations of American households, it was more than enough. By the middle of the 20th century, this powder wasn't a specialty item. It wasn't something you ordered from a catalog or tracked down at a hardware store on the other side of town. It was just there, sitting on the shelf under the sink or tucked beside the stove, or lined up next to the laundry basin in the basement. A yellow box, or sometimes a paper bag, modest and unassuming, the kind of thing you didn't notice until you needed it, and then you were glad it was there. Ask anyone who grew up in an American home between the 1920s and the 1960s and they'll tell you the same thing. Their mother had it. Their grandmother had it before that. It was simply part of the house, the way a broom was part of the house, the way a bar of soap was part of the house. Nobody made a big decision to buy it. You just bought it, the same way you bought salt. Because of course you did. Everyone did. The post-war boom years were particularly good to it. Families were moving into new homes, new suburbs, filling up new kitchens with new appliances, and the culture around domesticity was at an absolute peak. Magazines ran tips and household guides. Women's organizations published cleaning manuals. And through all of it, this powder kept showing up. Not as an advertisement, not as a sponsored mention, just as a fact. A given. Step 1. Make a solution of the powder. It was that embedded in the routine. Hardware stores kept it in bulk. Grocery stores stocked it by the case. Some families bought it 10 pounds at a time because at that price there was simply no reason not to. A single box cost less than $1, often considerably less, and it lasted for months. You weren't spending money on cleaning supplies. You were barely spending anything at all. And yet your house was clean. Your clothes were clean. Your pipes were clear. Your kitchen smelled like nothing, which in those days meant it smelled right. It crossed every class line, which was unusual for a consumer product even then. The family in the big house on the hill used it. The family in the apartment 2 floors up from the laundromat used it. Farmers used it. Factory workers brought it home. It didn't carry a brand identity or a social signal. It was just useful, and usefulness has never cared much about income. That democratic quality was part of what made it so deeply woven into everyday life. When it eventually disappeared, it left a gap that most people didn't even know how to name, because they had never thought of it as something that could go away. So how did it actually work? That's the part most people never stop to think about, because when something does its job quietly and completely, you don't tend to ask why. You just reach for the box. At its core, this powder was a simple alkaline compound, and alkalinity is really the key to understanding everything it could do. When you dissolve an alkaline substance in water, it raises the pH of that solution, and a high pH environment is deeply hostile to the kinds of molecules that make up grease, oil, and organic grime. Those molecules don't just get pushed around, they get broken apart at a chemical level. The bonds that hold fatty acids together come undone. The residue that was clinging to your stovetop or the collar of your shirt essentially stops being what it was. It becomes something water can carry away. Chemists call this process saponification when it happens to fats, and hydrolysis more broadly. You don't need to remember those words. What you need to understand is that this powder wasn't scrubbing your surfaces clean through force. It was dissolving the problem at its foundation. That distinction matters because it meant you didn't need much of it. A small amount dissolved in warm water had real, measurable power. And because the active chemistry was doing the heavy lifting, the physical effort required from you was almost incidental. It was also mildly abrasive in its dry form, which gave it that second function, the one that let people use it directly on stubborn stains or stuck-on residue without reaching for something harsher. The granules were fine enough that they wouldn't scratch most surfaces, but coarse enough to provide friction where friction was what you needed. 2 tools in one box. The same handful of powder could soften a stain in the wash and scour a pot in the sink. Then there was what it did to water itself. Hard water, which most households deal with to some degree, is full of dissolved minerals, calcium, magnesium, that interfere with cleaning. They bind to soap and reduce its effectiveness. They leave the film behind on glassware and tile. This powder neutralized those minerals. It softened the water as it cleaned, which made every other cleaning agent in the basin work better. It was, in a sense, improving the conditions for its own chemistry in real time, and none of this required a laboratory to understand or a chemistry degree to use. You just knew it worked. You knew a handful in a bucket of hot water would cut through almost anything. You knew a little in the laundry meant your whites came out whiter. The science was sophisticated. The experience of using it was not. That gap between complexity and simplicity, that's usually the signature of something genuinely well designed. But here's where the story gets complicated. Because something that works that well, that cheaply, that simply, it doesn't disappear on its own. It needs a push. And in the decades following World War II, that push came from somewhere very deliberate. The American economy was booming. Factories that had spent years producing for the war effort retooled almost overnight for consumer goods. And consumers, flush with post-war optimism and a growing middle-class confidence, were ready to spend. They wanted new things, modern things, things that felt like the future. And Madison Avenue understood that instinct better than almost anyone. The cleaning industry saw an opportunity, Not to invent something that worked better, because that, as it turned out, was nearly impossible, but to invent something that felt newer, something with a brand name, something in brighter packaging with a catchier jingle, something that didn't look like what your grandmother used. Companies like Procter & Gamble, Colgate-Palmolive, and a growing wave of household product manufacturers began pouring money into television advertising at a scale that had never existed before. The term soap opera wasn't an accident. Those daytime programs existed largely as vehicles to sell cleaning products to the women who stayed home and watched them. And the products being sold weren't defined primarily by what they did. They were defined by how they made you feel. Clean, modern, effortless, in control. Suddenly the market was flooded. A separate product for the toilet, a separate product for the kitchen counter, a separate spray for glass, a specific powder for the tub, a different one for laundry. Each one branded, each one with its own identity, each one suggesting that the old way of doing things with one simple powder was somehow inadequate, outdated, beneath you. And retailers responded accordingly. Shelf space is finite. It is, in many ways, the most valuable real estate in American commerce. When dozens of new branded products needed room, something had to give. The simple, unbranded $1 powder that had done everything quietly and reliably for generations started losing ground, first an inch, then a foot, then whole aisles. It wasn't that households stopped needing what this powder did. They still did. They always would. But the narrative had shifted. Efficiency wasn't glamorous anymore. Simplicity looked like poverty. The sale wasn't being made on performance now, it was being made on aspiration. And aspirations, as it turns out, are far easier to manufacture than chemistry. You can change them with a 30-second commercial. You can retire the old and introduce the new without a single scientific reason to do so. You just have to make people want to. And then came 1979. Not with a bang. Not with a government announcement or a dramatic recall or a scientist standing at a podium explaining what had gone wrong. It came quietly, the way most endings do, gradually, and then all at once. By the late 1970s, the powder's shelf presence had already been shrinking for years. But 1979 was the year that, in market after market, city after city, it simply stopped being restocked. Distributors moved on, warehouse space was reallocated. The buyers at major retail chains, the people who decide what gets ordered and what doesn't, started pulling it from their catalogs entirely. There was no press release. There was no farewell. 1 week it was there. The next week there was a bottle of something blue and heavily advertised sitting in its place. But here's where the story gets interesting. Because the powder didn't disappear, because it stopped working. It disappeared because the system around it had made it inconvenient to keep selling. The economics had shifted in a way that made a $1 multi-purpose product genuinely unattractive to the people controlling distribution. A retailer doesn't make money selling you one product that does everything. They make money selling you 6 products that each do one thing. The margin on a branded specialty cleaner was dramatically higher than anything a generic powder could generate. Manufacturers understood this. Distributors understood this. And by 1979, the retailers had fully committed to a product mix that simply had no room for something so stubbornly, unfashionably useful. There were also murmurs, and this is important to acknowledge carefully, about regulatory pressure. The late 1970s saw increased scrutiny on household chemical products. The EPA was expanding. Consumer safety legislation was tightening. And while the powder itself was never definitively declared harmful, the cost of navigating new labeling requirements, reformulation studies, and safety documentation was enough to discourage smaller manufacturers from continuing production. The big brands had legal departments and lobbying power to absorb those costs. A product with slim margins and no corporate champion behind it did not. Some historians of consumer culture point to this as a case study in what they call regulatory capture by attrition, where smaller independent products don't get banned outright. They simply get buried under compliance costs that only the powerful can afford to shoulder. Nobody had to make a single phone call to kill the powder. The conditions just made survival nearly impossible. And so it went. Not outlawed, not discredited, not proven dangerous, just discontinued. Quietly deprioritized. Allowed to age out of a market that had decided quite deliberately that it no longer needed something so simple. The powder had done nothing wrong. The world had simply reorganized itself around other interests. And yet, Knowing all of that, people still ask the question. They can't help it. Because when something useful disappears this cleanly, this completely, without scandal or recall or a single news headline, the human mind wants a villain. It wants a boardroom. It wants a memo. So let's address that directly. Was there a conspiracy? Did the major cleaning product companies actively coordinate to push the powder out? Did someone make a call, write a check, pull a string? The honest answer is, probably not. Not in the way that word implies. There was no secret meeting, no handshake agreement between executives in a smoke-filled room. What there was, instead, was something arguably more troubling, a system that produced the same outcome without requiring anyone to intend it. Think about what that means for a moment. You don't need a conspiracy when the incentives already point in the right direction. You don't need to suppress something when the market is perfectly capable of doing it for you. The powder didn't need enemies, it just needed to be inconvenient. And inconvenient it had become, for distributors juggling shelf space, for retailers chasing margin, for manufacturers who found the economics increasingly difficult to justify. Some people, particularly those who remember using it, find that explanation deeply unsatisfying, and their frustration is understandable, because the effect is identical whether the cause was malice or indifference. The product is gone either way. Their cleaning routine, once cheap and effective, was replaced by something more expensive and arguably less capable. Whether that happened by design or by drift, the result lands the same way in a person's home. What makes this story genuinely uncomfortable isn't the possibility of wrongdoing. It's the possibility that no wrongdoing was necessary. That markets, left to their own logic, will sometimes eliminate the most useful things, not because those things failed, but because they succeeded too quietly, too cheaply, for anyone powerful enough to protect them to bother doing so. Commerce doesn't require villains to produce losses. It just requires that the winners keep winning. And somewhere in a warehouse or a grandmother's cabinet, or a half-remembered brand name someone almost recalls, the powder waited. Not vindicated, not restored, just gone from the conversation. Which, for a lot of people who knew what it could do, felt like its own kind of wrong. But not everyone forgot. That's the part of this story that doesn't end in a warehouse or a discontinued product line. It ends in forums, in comment sections, in handwritten recipe cards passed between neighbors who still remembered the ratio, the texture, the specific way it foamed when it hit a greasy surface. There is a community of people, not loud, not organized in any formal sense, who simply refuse to let this go. They found each other gradually, the way people find each other when they share something obscure and useful. A mention in a homesteading blog, a thread on a cleaning forum where someone typed out their grandmother's instructions from memory and watched 40 strangers respond within an hour saying they knew exactly what she was talking about. These aren't conspiracy theorists. They're not angry. Most of them are just practical people who tried the powder once or grew up watching someone use it and couldn't understand why the modern alternatives felt like a step sideways dressed up as a step forward. Some of them tracked down the original formulation through old chemistry texts and household management guides from the mid-century. Others found surviving stock, old boxes, sealed, still functional, at estate sales and flea markets. A few figured out how to replicate it closely enough to matter, sourcing the component ingredients separately and combining them at home for pennies per batch. What's striking about these people is how little drama surrounds what they're doing. They're not staging a protest, they're just cleaning their sinks. They share results with photographs. They compare notes on surfaces and dilutions and stubborn stains that finally gave up after decades of resistance. And in doing that, quietly and without fanfare, they preserved something that the market decided wasn't worth keeping. They decided differently, not because of nostalgia exactly, but because the thing worked. And that, they concluded, was reason enough. If any of this sounds familiar, if you grew up watching a parent or grandparent reach for that same worn box, or if you've been quietly frustrated by cleaning products that promise everything and somehow deliver less, leave a comment below. Tell us what you remember. Tell us what you've tried. Because that's how this kind of knowledge survives. Not through corporate marketing budgets or shelf space negotiations, through people talking to each other. If you found this useful, share it with someone who still cares about things that actually work. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, the forgotten, the overlooked, the quietly useful things that slipped out of the mainstream before most of us thought to ask why.